On September 3, 2018, at approximately 4:37 in the afternoon, Jeddah time, a man wearing the simple white ihram garments required of all pilgrims landed at King Abdulaziz International Airport in Saudi Arabia. To the hundreds of other passengers disembarking from Royal Jordanian Flight 542 from Amman, he was invisible, just another Muslim fulfilling one of the 5 pillars of Islam by making the journey to Mecca. His passport identified him as Hassan Mahmoud al-Rifai, a 52-year-old businessman from Beirut traveling alone for Umrah, the lesser pilgrimage that can be performed at any time of year outside the official Hajj season. But to the 3 Mossad operatives who had been tracking his movements since he left Lebanon 8 hours earlier, he was someone else entirely. His real name was Bassam Khalil Nasser, and he was responsible for moving approximately $80 million per year from Iran to Hezbollah through a network of shell companies, front businesses, and underground banking channels that stretched from Tehran to Caracas. What happened over the next 11 days would become one of the most audacious surveillance operations in Mossad's history, requiring agents to track a high-value target through one of the most sacred sites in Islam, a place where Israeli intelligence had no official presence, no diplomatic cover, and where discovery would trigger an international incident that could destabilize the entire region. This is the story of how they did it anyway. The operation that would eventually be codenamed Pilgrim's Gate didn't begin in Saudi Arabia. It began 7 months earlier in a Mossad operations center in Tel Aviv, where analysts had been piecing together fragments of intelligence about Hezbollah's financial infrastructure. Understanding how Hezbollah funded its operations had been a priority for Israeli intelligence since the 2006 Lebanon War, when the organization demonstrated military capabilities that far exceeded what its known funding sources could support. The group's annual budget was estimated at somewhere between $700 million and $1 billion, money that paid for rockets, training, salaries for thousands of fighters, social services in Lebanon, and operations across the Middle East. Much of that funding came directly from Iran, but the mechanisms through which money moved from Tehran to Beirut remained frustratingly opaque to Western intelligence agencies. Traditional banking sanctions made direct transfers impossible, so the money had to flow through alternative channels, and Hezbollah had spent years developing sophisticated methods to evade financial surveillance. By early 2018, Mossad had identified what they believed was a key node in this financial network, a man named Bassam Khalil Nasser, who operated a chain of currency exchange offices in Beirut and maintained business relationships with individuals in Tehran, Damascus, and several Latin American capitals.
Nasser kept a low profile, avoided social media, rarely traveled internationally, and had never been directly linked to Hezbollah in any public way. He was not on any Western sanctions lists. He had no known military background. To anyone examining his business operations superficially, he appeared to be exactly what his public profile suggested, a successful money changer serving Lebanon's large expatriate community and the remittance needs of a country where personal connections often mattered more than institutional banking. But Mossad's financial intelligence unit, operating under the division known as Tevel, had been analyzing patterns in Hezbollah's spending and had identified something interesting. Every few months, there would be a spike in the organization's operational activity: new weapons purchases, payments to fighters, funding for infrastructure projects in southern Lebanon. And if you went back and looked at Nasser's business records, which Mossad had managed to access through penetration of Lebanese banking networks, there were corresponding movements of large sums through his exchange offices several weeks before each operational spike. The correlation was too consistent to be coincidental. Nasser was a conduit, a financial facilitator who moved money from Iran to Hezbollah while maintaining the appearance of legitimate business operations. The challenge Mossad faced was gathering proof. They needed to understand exactly how Nasser's operation worked, who his contacts were, how the money moved, and what vulnerabilities existed that could be exploited to disrupt the flow of funds. But Nasser was careful. He conducted business almost entirely in person, avoiding using phones for sensitive conversations, and operated in Beirut, a city where Mossad's ability to conduct surveillance operations was severely limited by Hezbollah's own counterintelligence capabilities. Attempting to run a physical surveillance operation on Nasser in Lebanon would be extraordinarily risky. Hezbollah controlled significant portions of Beirut and maintained its own intelligence service that was skilled at identifying and neutralizing foreign operatives. The organization had successfully uncovered several CIA and Mossad networks in Lebanon over the previous decade, and they were hyper-vigilant about protecting their leadership and key operational personnel. What Mossad needed was an opportunity to observe Nasser outside Lebanon, somewhere his guard might be lower, somewhere the operational environment was more permissive. That opportunity came in February 2018, when intercepts of Nasser's phone conversations revealed that he was planning to perform Umrah later that year. The conversation was brief and seemingly innocuous, Nasser speaking with his adult son about the possibility of making the pilgrimage together, discussing dates and logistics.
The son couldn't commit due to work obligations, so Nasser indicated he would go alone, probably in September, when the weather in Mecca was slightly cooler and the crowds were somewhat smaller than during Ramadan. For Mossad's Tevel division, this represented exactly the kind of opportunity they had been waiting for. Nasser would be traveling alone, outside his normal security environment, and spending multiple days in a location where his movements would follow predictable patterns dictated by religious observance. The Saudi authorities maintained extensive security and surveillance infrastructure in Mecca, but it was focused on protecting pilgrims and preventing terrorism, not on tracking specific individuals for foreign intelligence services. The problem was that Mossad had never conducted a surveillance operation inside Saudi Arabia's holy cities. Israel and Saudi Arabia had no diplomatic relations. Israeli citizens were forbidden from entering the kingdom, and the idea of Israeli intelligence operatives conducting surveillance inside the Grand Mosque in Mecca, even targeting a Hezbollah Financier, would be seen as a profound violation of Islamic sanctity if discovered. The political and diplomatic consequences would be catastrophic. But Tevel's director, a career intelligence officer named Yossi Mizrahi, who had spent 3 decades running covert operations across the Middle East, believed the opportunity was too valuable to pass up. He authorized a planning group to begin developing options for how a surveillance operation in Mecca might be executed. What they came up with over the following 4 months would require Mossad to deploy operatives with no prior connection to the organization, individuals who could pass as Muslim pilgrims from other countries, who spoke Arabic fluently, who understood Islamic religious practices well enough to blend in seamlessly, and who could operate in one of the world's most surveilled environments without leaving any trace of their activities. If you're enjoying this story, please subscribe to our channel and hit the like button. It helps us bring you more content like this. The team that would eventually be assigned to Operation Pilgrim's Gate consisted of 8 people, though only 3 would actually enter Saudi Arabia. The others would operate from a forward command post in a neutral location, probably somewhere in the Gulf states where Mossad maintained better access, coordinating logistics and providing analytical support. The 3 field operatives were chosen based on very specific criteria. They needed to be ethnically Arab or Persian, able to pass as citizens of Muslim-majority countries without arousing suspicion. They needed to be observant Muslims themselves, or have such deep knowledge of Islamic practice that they could convincingly perform the rituals required of pilgrims. And they needed to have experience operating in hostile or non-permissive environments, where mistakes could be fatal. The team leader was a Moroccan-born Israeli citizen named David Azoulay, though for this operation he would be traveling as Yusuf Al-Fassi, a telecommunications engineer from Casablanca, making his first Umrah. Azoulay was 41 years old, had been with Mossad for 16 years, and had conducted operations in multiple Arab countries under various covers. He was fluent in Arabic, French, and Hebrew, and more importantly, he had grown up in a traditional Muslim family in Morocco before his family immigrated to Israel when he was 17. He understood the cultural context, the religious significance of what they would be doing, and the extraordinary care required to avoid detection. The second operative was a woman named Yasmin Khouri, traveling under the identity of Fatima Hassan, a Syrian refugee living in Jordan who worked as a schoolteacher. At 38 years old, Khouri had spent most of her Mossad career working in intelligence gathering rather than field operations, but her background was perfect for this assignment. She had been born in Damascus to a Christian family, spoke multiple Arabic dialects, and had extensive knowledge of Syrian and Jordanian society that would make her cover credible under scrutiny. The decision to include a female operative in the team was carefully considered. Women performing Umrah were required to be accompanied by a male guardian, a mahram, who was either a close relative or husband. This restriction would normally make it difficult for a female operative to participate, but it also provided an opportunity. Khouri and Azoulay would be traveling as a married couple, which gave them more flexibility in their movements and made their presence less conspicuous than solo male travelers. The third operative was perhaps the most unusual choice. His name was Abbas Tehrani, though he would be using the identity of Mohammad Reza Hosseini, a 55-year-old businessman from Tehran involved in the carpet trade. Tehrani was not ethnically Arab. He was Iranian, born in Tehran, and had come to Israel as a political refugee in 1995 after his family had been targeted by the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps for their support of opposition movements. He had joined Mossad in 2001, motivated partly by a desire to work against the Iranian regime, and had become one of the organization's most valuable operatives for operations involving Iranian targets. His cover as an Iranian businessman performing Umrah was particularly useful because it would give him a natural reason to interact with other Iranian pilgrims, who made up a significant portion of Umrah visitors each year. If Nasser had any Iranian contacts he was meeting in Mecca, which Mossad suspected might be part of the reason for his trip,
Tehrani would be positioned to observe those meetings. The three operatives spent March through May 2018 preparing for the operation. This wasn't like training for a typical surveillance mission.
They needed to master not just the technical aspects of intelligence gathering, but also the religious and cultural elements that would allow them to move through Mecca as authentic pilgrims. They studied the specific rituals of Umrah, which differed slightly from the full Hajj pilgrimage. They learned the prayers that would be recited at specific locations around the Grand Mosque. They practiced the tawaf, the counterclockwise circumambulation of the Kaaba that pilgrims perform 7 times. They studied the sa'i, the walking between the hills of Safa and Marwa. They memorized the proper etiquette for visiting the other holy sites, how to behave, what to say, how to dress. But they were also preparing for an intelligence operation. They trained on miniaturized cameras and recording devices that could be concealed in clothing or personal items without being detected by the Saudi security services. They studied the layout of the Grand Mosque, which had been expanded multiple times and could accommodate up to 4 million worshippers during peak periods. They analyzed how Saudi authorities conducted security screening, what technologies they used, what patterns of behavior triggered additional scrutiny. They developed communication protocols that would allow them to stay in contact with each other and with the command post without using phones or electronic devices that might be intercepted. They created contingency plans for what to do if they were discovered, if they lost contact with each other, if Nasser changed his plans or left Mecca unexpectedly. By August 2018, when Mossad confirmed through additional intercepts that Nasser had finalized his travel arrangements for early September, the team was as ready as they could be for an operation that had no precedent in the organization's history. Azoulay and Khoury flew from Tel Aviv to Istanbul on August 28th, using their Moroccan and Syrian documents respectively. They spent 2 days in Istanbul establishing their cover, staying at a modest hotel in the Sultanahmet district, visiting mosques, behaving like a middle-class couple preparing for a religious journey. On August 30th, they flew from Istanbul to Jeddah on Turkish Airlines, passing through Saudi immigration without incident. Tehrani took a different route, flying from Tel Aviv to Dubai, then from Dubai to Tehran, where he spent 4 days meeting with relatives and old friends who still lived in Iran and who had no idea he was working for Israeli intelligence. This part of the operation was risky, but it was necessary to make his cover airtight. If Saudi authorities decided to investigate him for any reason and contacted Iranian officials, they needed to find records of a real person with a real history who had genuinely traveled from Tehran. On September 2nd, Tehrani flew from Tehran to Jeddah, clearing Saudi immigration with Iranian documents that identified him as Mohammad Reza Hosseini.
The 3 operatives were now in Saudi Arabia, staying at different hotels in Jeddah, maintaining no contact with each other until they received confirmation that their primary target had arrived. That confirmation came on September 3rd, when Nasser landed at King Abdulaziz International Airport. Mossad's Signals Intelligence Unit, monitoring Lebanese telecommunications, had intercepted Nasser's phone being used from the airport to call his family and confirm his safe arrival. The operation was now active. Over the next several hours, each of the 3 Mossad operatives independently made their way from Jeddah to Mecca, a distance of approximately 70 kilometers. They traveled separately on different buses at different times, following the routes used by millions of pilgrims every year. Saudi authorities maintained strict control over access to Mecca. The city was closed to non-Muslims, and entry points on all major highways featured checkpoints where guards verified that travelers possessed the appropriate documentation, including the Umrah visa and the vaccination certificates required of all pilgrims. Azoulay and Khoury, traveling as a married couple, cleared the checkpoint without issue, their Moroccan and Syrian documents examined briefly before being waved through. Tehrani, traveling alone as an Iranian businessman, was stopped for slightly longer questioning, but this was routine for Iranian nationals who received additional scrutiny due to political tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran. His cover story about being in the carpet trade and wanting to perform Umrah before beginning a business trip to Dubai satisfied the guards, and he was allowed to continue. By the evening of September 3rd, all 3 operatives were in Mecca, checked into separate accommodations in the neighborhood surrounding the Grand Mosque. They maintained no electronic communication with each other. Instead, they used pre-arranged meeting signals, physical indicators that would tell each operative where and when to rendezvous for brief in-person coordination. The first such signal was a red backpack placed in a specific location near the south entrance of the Grand Mosque at a specific time, visible for exactly 15 minutes before being removed. It was a simple system, but it was also secure.
Saudi authorities were looking for potential terrorists, for people carrying weapons or explosives, for individuals who might threaten the safety of pilgrims. They were not looking for intelligence operatives using Cold War tradecraft to conduct surveillance. The challenge now was finding Nasser among the hundreds of thousands of people who were in Mecca at any given time during Umrah season. Mossad knew from the intercepts that Nasser had booked accommodations at a hotel approximately 1 kilometer from the Grand Mosque, a mid-range establishment popular with Lebanese pilgrims. They knew his travel dates and his flight information.
But they didn't know his specific schedule, which religious sites he planned to visit, or how long he intended to stay in the city. And they couldn't simply maintain static surveillance on his hotel. That would be too conspicuous, too likely to be noticed by Saudi security or by Nasser himself. Instead, the Mossad team relied on the fact that Nasser would have to follow certain patterns dictated by the requirements of Umrah. Every pilgrim performing Umrah had to complete specific rituals at specific locations. They had to perform tawaf around the Kaaba. They had to perform sa'i between Safa and Marwa. They had to pray at designated times. These requirements meant that Nasser would have to visit the Grand Mosque repeatedly during his stay, and while the crowds made it difficult to spot any one individual, they also provided cover for the Mossad operatives to blend in and observe. Azulay made the first visual confirmation on September 4th, the day after Nasser's arrival. It was late afternoon, the time when many pilgrims visited the Grand Mosque for the Asr prayer, and Azulay had positioned himself on the ground floor of the mosque near one of the entrances, pretending to study a religious text while actually scanning the crowds entering the building. The Grand Mosque in Mecca is unlike any other structure on earth. Its central courtyard can hold hundreds of thousands of people, and during busy periods, the crowds are so dense that individual movement becomes nearly impossible. The Kaaba, the cube-shaped structure that Muslims around the world face during prayer, sits at the center of the courtyard, draped in black cloth embroidered with gold calligraphy. Pilgrims perform tawaf by walking counterclockwise around it in 7 circuits, a practice that dates back over 1,400 years. Finding one person in such an environment should have been impossible, but Azulay had advantages. He knew what Nasser looked like from photographs obtained through Lebanese sources. He knew approximately when Nasser had arrived and could estimate that a devout pilgrim would likely visit the mosque on his first full day in Mecca, and he positioned himself near an entrance that Lebanese pilgrims commonly used, based on the location of hotels in that area. At approximately 4:20 in the afternoon, Azulay saw him. Nasser was walking with a group of 4 other men, all wearing the white ihram garments, all appearing to be Lebanese based on their dialect and appearance. They entered the mosque together, removed their shoes, and made their way toward the courtyard where the Kaaba stood. Azulay waited several minutes before following, maintaining enough distance to avoid detection, but staying close enough to keep Nasser in sight. The group Nasser was with appeared to be other pilgrims he had met at his hotel or during his travels, not associates from his financial network. They performed tawaf together, walking the 7 circuits around the Kaaba, along with thousands of others, reciting prayers, raising their hands toward the structure as they passed the eastern corner where the black stone was embedded. Azulay participated in the tawaf as well, maintaining his cover as a pilgrim while keeping Nasser under observation. What he noticed during those 40 minutes was that Nasser was behaving exactly as a sincere pilgrim should. He was focused on the religious rituals, showing no signs of conducting business or engaging in any activity beyond worship. This was both reassuring and frustrating. Reassuring because it meant Nasser was not suspicious, not taking unusual security precautions that would make surveillance more difficult. Frustrating because it meant the operation might take longer than anticipated, if Nasser was truly in Mecca solely for religious purposes and not to conduct any financial meetings. After completing the tawaf, Nasser and his companions moved to perform sa'i, the walking between Safa and Marwa. This ritual commemorates Hagar's search for water for her son Ishmael and requires pilgrims to walk back and forth between 2 small hills 7 times, a distance of approximately 3 kilometers in total. The pathway is enclosed within the mosque complex and can accommodate tens of thousands of people simultaneously. Azulay followed at a distance, observing but not approaching. He documented everything mentally, noting who Nasser spoke with, how long he spent at each stage of the rituals, whether he displayed any behavior that seemed inconsistent with a religious pilgrim. By the time Nasser completed the sa'i and left the mosque complex, Azulay had confirmed the target's presence and established a baseline for his behavior. That evening, Azulay met briefly with Khoury at a predetermined location, a small shop selling prayer rugs near the Abraj al-Bayt towers that dominated the Mecca skyline. They exchanged information quickly, speaking in low voices in Moroccan Arabic.
appearing to anyone watching like a husband and wife discussing what souvenirs to purchase. Azoulay described his observation of Nasser. Corey reported that she had not yet spotted the target, but had identified several other Lebanese pilgrims who might be associated with him. They agreed to maintain rotating surveillance the following day, with Azoulay covering the morning hours and Corey taking the afternoon, while Tehrani would position himself to observe Iranian pilgrims in case Nasser made contact with anyone from Tehran. Over the next 5 days, from September 5th through September 9th, the pattern continued. Nasser visited the Grand Mosque multiple times each day, following the schedule of prayers and performing additional voluntary tawaf circuits around the Kaaba, which many pilgrims did to accumulate spiritual merit. He attended lessons and lectures delivered by religious scholars inside chambers of the mosque.
He took meals at restaurants near his hotel, usually in the company of the same group of Lebanese men he had befriended. He showed no indication of conducting any business activities, made no suspicious contacts, and behaved in every way like a devout Muslim fulfilling a religious obligation. The Mossad team documented all of it. They photographed everyone Nasser spoke with, later transmitting those images through encrypted channels to the command post, where analysts could attempt to identify the individuals. They noted the times of his movements, the routes he took, the locations he visited. They maintained a detailed timeline that would allow pattern analysts to identify any deviations or unusual behavior. But by September 9th, a week into Nasser's pilgrimage, with no indication that he was in Mecca for anything beyond religious purposes, the operation team back in Israel was beginning to question whether their assumptions had been wrong. Maybe Nasser really was just a businessman taking a religious journey. Maybe the financial patterns Mossad had identified were coincidental. Maybe they had deployed 3 operatives into one of the world's most sensitive locations for nothing more than surveillance of a middle-aged man's pilgrimage. Then on September 10th, everything changed. It began with a deviation from Nasser's established pattern. Instead of visiting the Grand Mosque for the morning Fajr prayer at dawn, which he had done every previous day, Nasser left his hotel at approximately 5:30 in the morning and walked in a different direction, heading not toward the mosque, but toward a less crowded area of the city, where smaller hotels and residential buildings stood. Tehrani spotted him first. The Iranian operative had been conducting his own religious observances at the Grand Mosque when he noticed Nasser's absence, which was unusual enough to warrant investigation. Following a hunch, Tehrani had positioned himself at a small cafe where he could observe the street leading away from Nasser's hotel, and he watched as the Hezbollah Financier walked past, alone, moving with apparent purpose. Tehrani followed at a considerable distance, careful not to be noticed. Nasser walked for approximately 15 minutes, turning several corners, doubling back once as if checking for surveillance, then entering a small apartment building on a quiet street. Tehrani could not follow him inside without being detected, so instead he found a position across the street where he could observe the building's entrance while appearing to be making a phone call. He waited there for 37 minutes before Nasser emerged, walking back toward his hotel with the same purposeful gait. Tehrani documented the location of the building and reported it that evening during a brief meeting with Azoulay. The team leader made the decision that they needed to identify who Nasser had been meeting, but doing so would require taking a risk.
They needed to get inside that building, or at least identify its residences, which meant potentially exposing themselves to discovery. The solution came from Corey, who volunteered to approach the building the following morning, posing as a Syrian refugee looking for accommodations. It was a credible cover. Many Syrian families fleeing the civil war had ended up in Saudi Arabia, and it would not be unusual for a woman to be seeking housing arrangements. On the morning of September 11th, Corey approached the apartment building Nasser had visited. She was dressed modestly in full abaya and hijab, carrying a small bag that contained a concealed camera no larger than a button. She entered the building, noting that it was a 4-story structure with perhaps 12 to 16 units, modestly maintained but not luxurious. A small lobby area had mailboxes for each unit, and Corey took several moments to examine them, photographing the names with her concealed camera while pretending to search for a specific address. Most of the names were Saudi, but one name on a 3rd-floor unit stood out because it was not Saudi at all. The mailbox for Unit 3B bore a small label with a name written in both Arabic and English, Hossein Karimi, an Iranian name. Corey completed her reconnaissance quickly and left the building, meeting with Azoulay later that day to transfer the photographs. The name Hossein Karimi meant nothing to any of the field operatives, but when it was transmitted back to Tel Aviv, the analytical team immediately recognized it. Hossein Karimi was not a real person. It was a known alias used by an Iranian intelligence officer who worked for the Quds Force, the external operations branch of the Islamic Revolutionary Guard Corps. His real identity was suspected to be Reza Ahmadi, though confirmation was difficult because Quds Force operatives rarely appeared in public records. What Mossad did know was that this particular officer specialized in financial operations, specifically in moving money to Iranian proxy organizations throughout the Middle East, and he had been linked to several previous meetings with Hezbollah financial operatives in locations including Syria, Lebanon, and now apparently in Mecca. The implications were immediate and significant. Nasser hadn't come to Mecca solely for religious purposes. He had come to meet with his Iranian handler or coordinator, using the pilgrimage as cover for a face-to-face meeting that would be impossible to conduct safely in Lebanon or Iran, where Western intelligence services maintain more robust surveillance capabilities. It was an elegant operational security measure. Saudi Arabia's holy cities represented neutral ground where Iranian and Hezbollah operatives could meet without worrying about Mossad or CIA surveillance, or so they thought. Over the next 2 days, the Mossad team shifted their surveillance to cover both Nasser and the apartment where the Iranian operative was staying.
They documented 2 more meetings between September 11th and September 12th, both conducted in the early morning hours before dawn, when the streets were quieter and surveillance would be more difficult to conduct without being noticed. Azoulay managed to position himself close enough during one meeting to observe through a window that the 2 men appeared to be reviewing documents, though he could not see what the documents contained. The meetings were brief, never lasting more than 45 minutes, and both men were careful to arrive and depart separately, with significant time gaps between their movements. On September 13th, Nasser's scheduled departure date, the Mossad team faced a decision. They had documented the meetings, they had identified the Iranian operative involved, they had confirmed that Nasser was using religious pilgrimages as cover for operational meetings. But they still didn't know the specific content of what was discussed or whether any physical materials had been exchanged. Tehrani proposed a high-risk option. Before Nasser left for the airport, someone needed to search his hotel room to see if he was carrying anything back to Beirut: documents, money, electronic storage devices, anything that might provide additional intelligence about Hezbollah's financial operations. It was dangerous. Hotel security in Mecca was significant, and any search would need to be conducted quickly, during a window when Nasser was definitely away from his room. But Azoulay agreed it was worth the risk. They had come this far, had operated successfully in one of the world's most sensitive locations for 10 days, and the opportunity to gain actionable intelligence might not come again. On the morning of September 13th, while Nasser performed his final prayers at the Grand Mosque before departing for Jeddah and his flight home, Khoury entered Nasser's hotel posing as a housekeeping supervisor. She was wearing a hijab and carrying cleaning supplies, her appearance unremarkable among the dozens of staff members working in the hotel. She had created a fake hotel identification badge using a small laminator and printer the team had brought with them, not perfect but good enough to pass casual inspection. Nasser's room was on the 3rd floor. Khoury had determined from observation that the actual housekeeping staff typically worked the 2nd and 4th floors during morning hours, leaving the 3rd floor temporarily unattended. She entered Nasser's room using a master key she had obtained through a brief interaction with a maintenance worker, claiming she had locked herself out of a supply closet and offering him 200 riyals for the loan of his key for 5 minutes. The room was modest, containing a single bed, a small desk, a closet, and a bathroom. Nasser's belongings were already packed, his suitcase sitting on the luggage rack, his travel documents arranged on the desk. Khoury worked quickly and methodically.
She photographed the documents on the desk, which included his plane ticket, his hotel receipt, and several pages of handwritten notes in Arabic. She carefully opened the suitcase, photographing its contents without disturbing the packing. Inside were clothes, toiletries, a prayer rug, several religious books, and a small leather journal. She photographed every page of the journal without removing it from the suitcase. The journal contained what appeared to be financial notations, columns of numbers and abbreviations that didn't immediately make sense, but that analysts might be able to interpret. Most significantly, Khoury found a small USB flash drive concealed inside a pocket of Nasser's travel bag. She photographed it in place, then made the decision to copy its contents. She had brought a small portable device designed specifically for rapid data extraction, a piece of technology no larger than a pack of cigarettes that could duplicate the contents of a USB drive in under 2 minutes. She connected Nasser's flash drive to the device, initiated the copying process, and waited, watching the progress bar advance while listening for any sound from the hallway that might indicate someone approaching. The process completed in 87 seconds. She disconnected the flash drive, returned it to the exact position where she had found it, photographed the suitcase one more time to confirm everything was in place, closed the luggage, and left the room. The entire search had taken less than 6 minutes. Khoury walked out of the hotel, disposed of her fake badge in a trash bin 3 blocks away, and met with Azoulay at a predetermined location to transfer the data and photographs. By the time Nasser returned to his hotel room to collect his belongings and depart for the airport, there was no indication that anyone had been inside. The 3 Mossad operatives left Mecca separately over the following 24 hours. Azoulay and Khoury departed on September 14th,
taking a bus back to Jeddah and then flying to Istanbul before making their way separately back to Tel Aviv. Tehrani stayed an additional day, performing his own final prayers and then traveling to Dubai before returning through Tehran to maintain his cover. By September 16th, all three operatives were safely out of Saudi Arabia, and the data they had collected was being analyzed by Mossad's technical and financial intelligence teams. The contents of the USB drive Corey had copied proved to be extraordinarily valuable. It contained spreadsheets detailing financial transactions running into tens of millions of dollars, lists of shell companies and front businesses in multiple countries, banking information for accounts in Lebanon, Syria, Venezuela, and several African nations. The handwritten notes from Nasser's journal provided additional context, explaining some of the abbreviations and codes used in the spreadsheets and identifying several individuals by their operational aliases.
Most importantly, the intelligence confirmed that Iran was using religious pilgrimages as opportunities for face-to-face coordination with Hezbollah financial operatives. The meetings in Mecca had been used to pass instructions, update procedures, and coordinate the next phases of money transfers that would fund Hezbollah operations for the coming year. Armed with this intelligence, Mossad was able to identify multiple financial channels and begin working with partner intelligence services and financial regulators in the United States and Europe to disrupt them. Over the following 18 months, several of the shell companies identified in Nasser's data were sanctioned, bank accounts were frozen, and the flow of Iranian money to Hezbollah was significantly constrained. The operation remained classified for several years after its completion. The risks associated with revealing that Israeli intelligence had conducted surveillance inside Mecca were too great, and the intelligence gains were too valuable to compromise by premature disclosure. But in 2023, after Bassam Khalil Nasser was killed in an Israeli airstrike in southern Lebanon, some details of Operation Pilgrim's Gate began to emerge through carefully managed leaks to journalists who covered intelligence matters. Nasser's death was officially attributed to his role as a Hezbollah commander, which was true, but Israeli officials privately acknowledged that he had been targeted partly because of intelligence gathered during his 2018 pilgrimage to Mecca, intelligence that had taken years to fully exploit, and that had helped Israel map out much of Hezbollah's financial infrastructure. The operation demonstrated something that intelligence professionals had long understood, but that the public rarely appreciated. Espionage in the real world was not about car chases or shootouts or dramatic confrontations. It was about patient observation in difficult environments, about taking calculated risks to gather information that might not yield immediate results, but that could prove valuable months or years later. It was about operatives who could blend seamlessly into foreign societies, who could maintain their cover under intense pressure, who could function effectively in places where discovery meant imprisonment or death. For the three Mossad operatives who had spent 11 days conducting surveillance in one of Islam's holiest cities, Operation Pilgrim's Gate represented both a professional achievement and a personal challenge. They had operated in an environment where their presence violated not just Saudi law, but also the sanctity of a religious site that held profound meaning for over 1 billion Muslims worldwide. Whether that operation was justified, whether the intelligence gains outweighed the moral and ethical costs of conducting espionage in such a location, remains a question that admits no easy answer. What is certain is that the operation succeeded in its objectives. Nasser was identified, his meetings with Iranian intelligence were documented, his financial records were compromised, and the networks he had spent years building were systematically dismantled. And perhaps most significantly from Mossad's perspective, the operation proved that even in places where Israeli intelligence was believed to have no access, where the operational challenges seemed insurmountable, patient planning and skilled operatives could still achieve results. We hope you enjoyed this story. Write in the comments what city you're watching us from, and don't forget to subscribe to our channel for more content like this. Your support helps us continue bringing you these detailed accounts of intelligence operations that shaped our modern world.